Before I get into the meat of this video, here are 3 promises. I am not doing this for attention. I will not use the word drip. I will actually say something new. I was first introduced to Melty Blood AACC 4 years ago, and I have had mixed feelings about its characters ever since. I began working on this script a few months ago when criticisms of Melty Blood character designs first arose. I happened to agree the characters were bland, and I was kind of surprised to see such strong opposition. After careful consideration, I collected my thoughts on the matter and decided to make this video. The production values will be a little low because I wanted to get it out while Type Lumina is still fresh. Sorry if I ramble. Unfortunately, in the time it took me to chip away at this script, the discussion has turned into the usual echo chamber that defines the modern internet. I won't pick sides in that fight because I think it's extremely artificial, and signal boosting it only gives attention to attention whores. Please just consider this video as its own exploration of fighting game character design. I think something productive can emerge from it. Bland means insipid or without distinct flavor. For visual character design, this means there is little to visually distinguish a character from other characters. I find that asking myself, how can I tell if this is an X character, is a good way to find if a character is bland or not. If there isn't a strong, consistent answer to that question, then the character is probably bland. These are BlazBlue characters, these are King of Fighters characters, these are Tekken characters. BB and Tekken both have robots that can fly around and slash their enemies apart with blades, but the BB robot would never be mistaken for the Tekken robot. Each series has distinct character design rules that help to distinguish the roster from other games. As a rule, characters should not be bland without good reason. The point of any work of art is to get an emotional reaction from the audience or player. A character who fades into the background will have a harder time doing that. Character design is naturally affected by many stylistic elements, like the use of color, shading, art style, posture, and so on, just like any work of art. A character is not good or bad simply because he does or does not have certain characteristics. There are plenty of bad swordsman characters that nobody could defend, regardless of how much he likes swordsman characters. Further complicating matters are the different levels of action, for lack of a better term, between a visual novel and a fighting game. VN characters can have hours and hours to explore the depth of their personalities, especially in a long-form work like Tsukihime. Fighting game characters are meant to be immediately visually distinct and grab the player's attention. You should see someone on the character select screen and instantly know if he'll be fast, slow, straightforward, weird, and so on. The primary purpose of any fighting game character is to get into fights and look cool doing it. You can see how these design philosophies are at odds with each other. So how do you translate non-action characters into an action-focused genre like fighting games? There are 2 broad approaches that one can take here. Redesign the characters to look more action-focused in the fighting game, or design the fighting game to align with the characters. We have a perfect example of the former in Persona 4 Arena, which features characters from Persona 3 and Persona 4 being redesigned to work in a flashy anime fighter. Persona 3 Akihiko is a cool-headed, reserved young man. He practices boxing, but he isn't a full-time athlete. If you look at his P3 art, you can see almost all of his body is covered except for his face, and he follows the school uniform almost perfectly. This all implies formality or a closed nature. However, his face has a bandage on it covering up what seems to be a cut on the temple, which is a common boxing injury. This implies he's an athlete or somewhat physical, and that he has an open nature at least some of the time. Persona 4 Arena Akihiko looks like he wandered in from a post-apocalyptic action manga. Shirtless, tattered cape and torn pants, giant red combat boots, bright red boxing gloves. He also carries a knife, although I don't think he ever uses it. For a fighting game, this is a well-made design. It implies aggression, speed, and a boxing style, which are all true of Akihiko in P4A. He's a boxer. He uses his hands. Make his hands bright red. Red is a stimulant color. You get the picture. Persona 3 Akihiko has a direct foil in Junpei, who is a young man at the same school and about the same age. Junpei also fights, but he has a totally different personality from Akihiko. Junpei is arrogant, short-sighted, tactless, and generally kind of a jackass. For a fair chunk of the early game, his heart isn't even in the right place. He only joins the party and helps fight shadows because he likes fighting. You can see elements of this personality in Junpei's design. He's mostly covered, like Akihiko, but he isn't wearing the uniform properly. Akihiko wears a tie, Junpei pops his collar and wears a necklace. Akihiko carries his jacket over his shoulder when he doesn't need to wear it, but Junpei wears his all the time even if he doesn't need to. Akihiko is a boxer who wears leather gloves, but Junpei is the one who clenches his fist. Isn't that funny? Over the course of Persona 3, Junpei learns how to be less of a jerk and sort of turns into a nice guy, or at least a better guy. In Persona 4 Arena, they focused on this side of his personality and made him a baseball player, specifically a Little League coach. Because baseball is so popular in Japan, I think this is sort of cultural shorthand to show that he grew out of being a thug and channeled his aggression into something productive. His design is a lot more open as well. The bright colors make his silhouette easier to read, and you can see just from his pose that he seems to have a much more open nature. He wants to compete, not just to fight. He's a well-adjusted guy now. He plays baseball. Make the baseball bat bright red. Red is a stimulant color. You get the picture. The same general philosophy is true for just about every P3 and P4 character in P4A, which presents an issue for fans of the source games. Do you respect the new designs because they work well for a fighting game, a genre that you may not enjoy or appreciate, or do you dislike the designs because they take the subtlety and nuance of the P3 and P4 characters and throw them out the window? Ultimately, this is a personal decision, but I prefer the alternate designs that we have in P4A. I think it's helpful to look at P4A Akihiko as Akihiko if he were a fighting game character instead of an unfaithful adaptation of him. For Melty Blood, I think French Bread decided to take the other approach and design a fighting game that more closely aligned with the Tsukihime characters. Admittedly, I don't know much about the Tsukihime characters, but I think they generally look pretty plain for anime-styled characters, with the exception of some villains like Nero and Roa and Hime. The depth of their character is meant to appear during the hours you spend reading the visual novel, wherein you learn there is more to these characters than meets the eye. Shiki doesn't look like he has magic powers that can kill people and destroy things, but he does. Thus, the game's overall presentation is also pretty plain, insofar as the stages mostly look like normal places that real people could live or exist. Mostly. There's an airport, a city square, a mansion, but also strange obelisks and landscapes that don't look entirely real. It's a neat contrast, but I think it's clear that the game is trying to be plain first, magical second. I personally don't care much for this approach, and I think the more extravagant visual elements in the game, the crazy stages, the characters like Nero and Roa and Warachiya, are 1,000 times more interesting than the plain characters like the Tonos, from a visual perspective. When Roa summons lightning, it seems like a natural extension of what he can do. He looks like some kind of wizard or sorcerer who is fully comfortable with his powers. When a plain character like Satsuki performs a huge punch, it seems like that's the extent of what she can do. She's a relatively plain-looking girl, so it stands to reason that the style of her attacks is equally plain. No, hunching forward is not a personality. Then you have someone like Tono Akiya, who looks just as plain as Satsuki, but who has the magical powers that befit a character like Roa. I personally found that very confusing when I first touched the game 4 years ago. Honestly, I do still find it confusing, but I've just gotten used to it. I don't empathize with these characters based on how they look, I empathize with them based on their gameplay and their animations. This is not necessarily a problem, but I think it can be hard to navigate a complex game like Melty Blood when you don't immediately have a good grasp of a character. For instance, I really like playing Full Moon Hisui because I like Full Moon mechanics, and I think it's funny that Hisui attacks with tables, chairs, frying pans, and so on. I would never have guessed that I would like Hisui just by looking at her on the character select screen. Did I make this video just to get angry at Melty Blood? Hardly. I really like playing Melty Blood, and I think it's a great fighting game, but no fighting game is perfect, and in addition to Melty Blood's mechanical problems, I think it has a character design style that makes it less distinct from other fighting games. The style may be intentional, but that's no excuse. I simply want people who are neck-deep in both Melty Blood and Tsukihime, yes, they're different, to understand the characters are very plain, yes, even bland, and that disliking the game for the character designs is okay. I'm never going to read Tsukihime, I just don't like VNs. I'm still allowed to have an opinion on the characters I play and play against in a fighting game. Otherwise, what's the point? Why even make a fighting game if I'm not allowed to judge it as one? When I look at Tonoshiki, I don't think protagonist with powerful, harmful magic. I think grunt from a side-scrolling beat-em-up who will drop a knife for me when I defeat him. And no, it's not just because of the school uniform. When I look at Koma, I don't think cursed nobleman who is restraining his inner demonic blood. I think martial arts man who trains very hard and whom I've seen 100 times before. Are Koma's fire effects meant to show his demonic powers, or do they just sell the impact of his strikes? Based on the conventions of every other fighting game I've ever played, it's just visual fluff. The inner depths of these characters come through decently in combat, but if I were to spend even a few minutes playing around with each character in each moon style, that's hours of time. A character's glance value is very important to me, especially for a game like AACC, which is the final result of several revisions and iterations on the basic Melty Blood formula. I don't want to cop out and say everybody has his own preferences and nothing is wrong or right, because that is both untrue and an insult to your time and intelligence. If you cared enough to watch this far, you deserve a proper conclusion. I believe the Tsukihime characters should have been altered or redesigned to work better in a fighting game rather than having the fighting game's aesthetics created around them. Melty Blood is a beautiful game in many ways, but I think it would have been better if it had embraced the more extravagant and crazy parts of its setting and characters. No, this does not mean I think Koma would look better if he were covered in belt straps and had bright red boxing gloves. That would ruin the character. I think if he just wore his coat during gameplay, it would have been fine. Just give me some visual cue that he isn't a typical martial arts dude. For a more clear-cut example, we can go outside of fighting games. Against my better judgment, I spoke to one person in a Discord server about this topic, and he brought up the example of Mario spin-off games like Mario Kart. The point he made was Mario and the rest of the gang look really out of place in a racing game, even one as silly as Mario Kart. You have the cartoony Mario characters driving these giant vehicles that range from reasonable to completely absurd. Why take characters designed for platformers and then have them drive go-karts? I agreed with him and told him he was proving my point, which he didn't appreciate. The conversation unraveled afterwards, but the analogy got me to thinking. Even in the Mario spin-off games, there are clear examples of characters being adjusted to work better in a particular genre. Recent Mario Kart games have Princess Peach, Princess Daisy, and Rosalina dressed in these sort of racing suits instead of their usual frilly dresses. I think they look much more at place in a racing game when dressed like this. I think it'd be really cool if the rest of the cast had their own racing attire that helped to express their personalities. Mario and Luigi suits would be spotless and worn professionally, Wario and Waluigi's suits would be dirty and oily, Bowser's suit would be covered in scorch marks or half shredded. You get the idea. In fact, Mario Golf Super Rush actually did something like this for its characters. Instead of just having Mario characters holding golf clubs, each one is dressed for a day at the country club, at least the ones that wear clothes. It's simple, but I think it lends the game a lot of charm and helps elevate it from being just another Mario spin-off game. I never knew that Bowser thought flame decals on his visor looked cool, but it makes total sense. Wario wearing a tacky 10-gallon hat, a shirt that barely contains his gut, and these hideous pants is just perfect. I love it. That's exactly what Wario would do at a country club. I think that a similar design philosophy that blended the plain nature of Tsukihime characters with the more action-focused sensibilities of a fighting game would have had better glance value and made the characters feel more distinct. Melty Blood already does a great job with most characters' animations and visual effects, but getting to those from the character select screen could just be a bit more engaging. Thanks for watching. If there's a point you want to make or something you think I missed, feel free to tell me. My knowledge of visual design and fighting games is pretty limited, so I'm always open to new ideas. I'm also aware that coming from a Guilty Gear background, and especially playing characters like Raven and Faust, my sensibilities are definitely weirder than the average person. You can look at the characters I play in other fighting games and see that I almost always choose weirdos. I didn't want to mention this at the start of the video since people would probably just discredit what I have to say based on my tastes, but it is worth mentioning. If you like this video, feel free to subscribe. I have a pretty slow upload schedule, so that's the best way to keep track of me. See you next time, and take care.